In the frozen heart of 16th century Russia, one man would rise above the throne, not as a ruler, but as a living curse. He called himself God's chosen Tsar, yet his reign dripped with the blood of the innocent. Behind gilded doors and the echo of church bells, Ivan IV, remembered as Ivan the Terrible, transformed divine power into divine punishment. His passions were as violent as his prayers, his love as lethal as his sword. This is not merely the story of a tyrant, it is the story of a mind consumed by lust, loss, and the unbearable hunger for control. Welcome to When Lust Ruled the Throne. Moscow, winter of 1538. The Kremlin lay silent beneath a sky of iron. Inside its frozen corridors, a boy of 8 watched his mother convulse on a silk bed, her lips darkened by poison. Ivan, son of Vasily III, heir to all Russia, would never forget the sound, that final wet gasp before silence. The woman who shielded him from the wolves of the court was gone, and those wolves were already circling. For the boyars, the old Russian nobles, a child Tsar was an opportunity. They tore apart the empire like starving beasts, each claiming authority in his name while denying him warmth, food, or comfort. Ivan and his younger brother, Yuri, were left half-naked in dark halls, scavenging scraps while their guardians feasted nearby. Servants who once bowed before the Grand Prince now spat in the children's bowls. The throne of Russia had become a cage. Night after night, Ivan wandered the shadowed corridors of the Kremlin. In the torchlight, he whispered prayers not of peace, but of vengeance. He learned early that mercy brought only pain. In time, the boy found joy in cruelty, hurling small animals from palace windows, watching them break upon the cobblestones below. It was not mere sadism. It was education. The world had taught him that suffering was power, and power was survival. When he was 10, the boyars forced him to watch a loyal servant beaten to death for defending him. Ivan said nothing, only memorized every face in the crowd. Later that night, he took a live bird, ripped off its wings, and whispered, "Now you are free." The act, small and savage, was a prophecy of the man he would become. By adolescence, the palace was both his prison and his hunting ground. The courtiers began to fear his silence, the way his gaze lingered, unblinking, as though measuring the softness of their throats. When famine struck Moscow, Ivan saw peasants clawing mud for bread, while nobles mocked their hunger with golden feasts. The hypocrisy stoked a hatred that would later scorch the empire itself. At 16, the boy who had been starved of love demanded his coronation, the first to be crowned Tsar of all Russia. As the incense of the coronation filled the cathedral, Ivan's face remained expressionless. The patriarch's blessing echoed through the vaults, but in the young ruler's mind, another vow formed, one whispered not to God, but to the ghosts that raised him. No one would ever humiliate him again. That day, the boy who once trembled in the cold became a ruler who would make all of Russia tremble instead. He rode from the cathedral like a conqueror, the golden crown glinting like firelight against the snow. Those who had mocked him bowed now to their creation, a Tsar forged from betrayal, isolation, and the quiet hunger for absolute control. Behind his pale eyes burned a single truth: love had died beside his mother. What remained was something colder, sharper, the seed of cruelty, nourished by fear. And as the Kremlin bells tolled, their sound was not a celebration of a new beginning, but the first echo of a reign that would drown a nation in blood. In the winter of 1547, Moscow glittered with torches and trembling hope. The boy who had been starved of love was now a man, 23, crowned Tsar, and at last choosing a bride. For the first time, the people believed their ruler might become something more than a shadow of cruelty. Her name was Anastasia Romanovna, daughter of a noble but humble family, known for her gentleness, her calm, her unshakable faith. When Ivan first saw her, she did not kneel. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, eyes lowered, the faintest trace of warmth crossing her lips. That small act of grace pierced through the fortress of his soul. For a brief, fragile season, love became his rebellion against the darkness that had shaped him. Their wedding was unlike any the Kremlin had seen. The golden dome shimmered beneath winter sunlight as choirs filled the air with sacred hymns. The Tsar, dressed in imperial robes, looked less like a conqueror than a man reborn. The people whispered that Anastasia's presence softened him, that she tamed the monster within. And for a while, they were right. In those first years, Russia flourished. Ivan spoke of justice, of uniting his fractured land. He punished corrupt nobles, reformed laws, and opened trade with distant lands. The boyars watched uneasily as their puppet became a sovereign. But Anastasia's influence was his anchor, her voice the only one that could calm the storms that raged behind his eyes. Yet love, for Ivan, was never gentle. It was possession wrapped in devotion, the hunger to own, to control, to merge entirely with what he adored. He demanded that Anastasia never leave his sight, her every word and gesture scrutinized. When courtiers praised her beauty, Ivan's smile hid a flicker of jealousy, sharp and venomous. He feared betrayal not from his enemies, but from the one person he could not command without destroying. Whispers spread through the palace that the Tsar's tenderness could turn to fury without warning, that his affection burned too fiercely to be safe. One night, as snow fell beyond their chamber, Ivan woke to find Anastasia gone. Panic gripped him like a blade. He stormed through corridors barefoot, calling her name. She had simply gone to pray. But when he found her kneeling before an icon, tears on her cheeks, his relief came not as mercy, but as rage. He fell at her side, trembling, begging her to never leave him again. His love became a chain, polished, sacred, and unbreakable. Anastasia, patient and devout, endured it with quiet sorrow. She saw what few dared to see. Behind the Tsar's devotion was a child who had never learned to trust the living. Years passed, and cracks appeared beneath the peace. The reforms slowed, the temper flared. Ivan began to suspect the boyars still plotted against him, that even his own council whispered treason when he turned away. Anastasia tried to temper his fury, but her gentle counsel began to sound like contradiction to him. He saw shadows in every smile, betrayal in every silence. Still, she prayed for him each night, even as he drifted further from the man she had married. In those days, Moscow stood between two worlds, one of light, born of her grace, and one of darkness, born of his fear. And though neither of them yet knew it, that fragile balance would soon collapse. For in a court that fed on secrets and poison, even love could be weaponized. When Anastasia's laughter faded from the palace halls, the Tsar would never laugh again. The warmth she had brought would become the fire that consumed him, and Russia would soon discover that a man who loses love will seek comfort only in power and blood. By the summer of 1560, the Kremlin had grown quieter, too quiet. The courtiers spoke in whispers, the servants moved like ghosts. Anastasia, once the radiant heart of the Tsar's world, had fallen ill. Her skin, once luminous, turned pale as wax. Her laughter, once the sound of grace, was replaced by weak coughs that echoed through the marble chambers. Ivan refused to believe it. He called upon healers, monks, even foreign physicians who spoke in riddles and burned strange herbs by her bedside. Nothing worked. Each day, her body weakened, and with it, the fragile restraint that had bound Ivan's darker nature. He sat beside her for hours, eyes hollow, muttering prayers half to God, half to the devils he feared might already be at work. Soon, rumors began to slither through the palace, whispers that Anastasia had been poisoned. The boyars, the very nobles who had tormented Ivan as a child, now became his invisible enemies once more. Their smiles at court appeared too polished, their condolences rehearsed. Every soft word they offered sounded like mockery. The Tsar's grief began to ferment into suspicion, his love into fury. When Anastasia finally died, the church bells of Moscow rang not in solemn reverence, but in dread. The Tsar did not weep before his court. He simply stood beside her lifeless body, expressionless, his fingers resting against her cold cheek. Only later, when the chamber was empty, did he scream, a sound so raw that guards outside the room swore it was not human. He tore at his robes, struck the walls until his hands bled, and cursed every noble in his kingdom. He demanded to see her body again and again, unable to accept that the light had truly gone out. She was pure, he whispered, too pure for this world. Then, quieter still, they took her from me. From that day, even began to change. The prayers grew louder, the nights longer. He stopped sleeping, wandering through the Kremlin with eyes like frostbitten glass. He summoned boyars at random hours, questioning them about plots they had never made, crimes they could not name. One by one, he banished or executed them, convinced that treachery had seeped into every corner of his realm. Even the church could not calm him. When the Metropolitan of Moscow urged forgiveness, Ivan laughed bitterly. Forgiveness? He hissed. God forgave them when they poisoned my angel. I shall not. The Tsar's wrath soon reached beyond the palace. He began to confiscate estates, imprison priests, and purge entire families for imagined conspiracies. To the people, it seemed as though he had declared war upon his own soul and was determined to make the whole of Russia suffer for it. But behind his public rage lay something more intimate, more terrifying. In the nights following Anastasia's death, servants claimed to hear him speaking softly in empty corridors, as though to someone unseen. At times they found him kneeling before her portrait, stroking the painted cheek with trembling fingers, murmuring her name like a prayer or a curse. And in the dark hours before dawn, the palace guards reported seeing him seated alone by her bed, long after her body had been buried. You are still with me, he whispered to the silence. You cannot leave me. Not you. That silence, patient, eternal, became his companion. From grief was born madness. From love, tyranny. And in the shadow of the dead Tsarina, Ivan the Fourth began to craft the machinery of terror that would make his name eternal. The walls of the Kremlin had watched him lose his mother and his bride. Now they would witness the birth of a monster. The year was 1565, and Moscow awoke to silence. The Tsar had vanished. For weeks, no word came from the Kremlin. The streets whispered of revolt, of divine wrath, of a ruler driven mad by grief and betrayal. Then, like a thunderclap across frozen fields, Ivan's message arrived, a decree written in his trembling hand, sealed with his own blood. He renounced his throne. He accused his nobles, the clergy, and even his council of poisoning his beloved wife and conspiring against his divine rule. The boyars panicked. The empire teetered on collapse. The people, terrified of chaos, begged him to return. And return he did, but not as a ruler seeking peace. Ivan came back as a prophet of vengeance. What he created next was not government, but nightmare. He called it the Oprichnina, a secret state within the state, ruled only by him. From the ashes of old Russia rose a new order, black-clad horsemen, faces hidden beneath hoods, carrying the symbols of their power, a dog's head and a broom. The head to sniff out treason, the broom to sweep it away in blood. These were not soldiers. They were executioners anointed by fear. Ivan called them his chosen, God's instruments of purification. They swore oaths to the Tsar alone, forsaking family, faith, and mercy. They rode through towns at dawn, dragging nobles from their beds, branding their wives, and nailing the accused to monastery gates. No one was safe. The Oprichniki would arrive unannounced, their black horses thundering through snow, their bells tolling like funeral chimes. They seized lands, burned entire estates, and slaughtered anyone whose loyalty wavered. Ivan watched from his window, eyes lit by the glow of burning villages, whispering psalms as if each death were a holy offering. To justify his terror, he wrapped it in religion. He wore monastic robes, called himself both priest and executioner. His hands, once trembling with grief, now performed blessings over corpses. In his sermons, he claimed the blood of traitors cleansed Russia's soul, that he, like the prophets of old, was chosen to purge sin from his people. But the purge never ended. The lines between sinner and saint dissolved in the red mist of paranoia. Even the loyal Oprichniki began to vanish, one by one, devoured by the machine they had built. Ivan would summon them to banquets, toast their faithfulness, and moments later have them strangled before dessert. Their families were marched to public squares and executed beneath icons of Christ. Cities like Suzdal, Torzhok, and Klind under his command. Monasteries were desecrated, priests mutilated, relics defiled. The Tsar believed God watched and approved. To him, every scream was a hymn, every corpse a sacrifice on the altar of divine justice. In the heart of Moscow, the people stopped speaking his name. They called him Grozny, the Terrible, not in rebellion, but in fear. The man who once sought to unite Russia now ruled by dividing it, the loyal against the damned, the pure against the impure, himself against the world. And as the snow fell upon the empty streets, the Black Riders continued their work, sweeping across the land like a plague. The Tsar's power had become absolute, not because his people loved him, but because they no longer dared to breathe without his permission. Ivan prayed every night before an icon of the Virgin Mary, tears streaking his face, whispering, "Forgive me, for I do your will." But the silence that answered him was the same that filled every execution ground across his empire, the silence of a God who no longer listened. After years of terror, Moscow had learned to live beneath the shadow of Ivan's wrath. Yet even as his Oprichniki spread fear across Russia, the Tsar himself was haunted by a ghost, the memory of his beloved wife, Anastasia. Her death had shattered him, and no bloodshed, no prayer, no punishment could silence her voice in his dreams. He saw her in every mirror, heard her laughter in the echo of cathedral bells. The woman who once soothed his fury had become the phantom that drove it. But Ivan could not live without a queen. He believed that only through a new wife could he cleanse the curse that had befallen him, the curse of betrayal, poison, and grief. So he announced a ritual unlike any seen before in Christendom, the bride trials. From across the empire, hundreds of young women were summoned to the Kremlin, peasants, daughters of nobles, even the orphans of war. They arrived trembling, escorted by guards, faces veiled in white linen as if walking to their own funerals. For Ivan, this was not a search for love. It was a ceremony of control. The Tsar sat upon his gilded throne in the great hall, surrounded by his black-robed attendants. One by one, the women were paraded before him like offerings. He studied them with the cold precision of a butcher examining meat, their skin, their posture, the steadiness of their gaze. Some fainted before reaching him. Others tried to smile, their lips trembling as Ivan's eyes burned through them. He spoke softly to a few, even gently, asking about their families, their faith, their fears. But his tone could change in an instant. If he sensed hesitation, if a word displeased him, he would dismiss them with a wave of his hand. "Unworthy," he'd whisper. And the girl would vanish. No one knew where they went, only that their names were never spoken again. Rumors spread of secret chambers beneath the Kremlin where the rejected brides were taken. Some said their bodies were found floating in the Moskva River, their faces veiled just as before. Others claimed they were buried in unmarked graves near the convent walls. The court whispered, the people prayed, but none dared to question the Tsar's will. To Ivan, beauty was both temptation and curse. He believed the perfect wife must be pure, untouched by sin, untainted by deceit. Yet his idea of purity was twisted by paranoia. The more he desired a woman, the more he distrusted her. He would test her loyalty with cruelty, demanding obedience through humiliation. A trembling glance could be mistaken for treason, a tear for proof of guilt. Among the chosen few who survived his trials, none lasted long. One fell ill and died within days. Another was accused of plotting with a servant and disappeared before dawn. Each failure deepened his madness, convincing him that no woman could match Anastasia's sacred memory. His palace became a mausoleum of ghosts, a place where beauty meant danger and affection meant death. Sometimes, late at night, Ivan would wander the corridors barefoot, calling out her name. "Nastya," he'd whisper into the dark. "They cannot replace you." Servants hid as he passed, his face streaked with tears and candlelight. The Tsar's longing had turned into ritualized cruelty, a holy obsession where love and punishment became one. His court lived in dread of the next selection, the next decree, the next scream echoing through the marble halls. And so the bride trials continued, not to find a queen, but to feed a void that no living woman could ever fill. Ivan's heart had rotted into a relic, preserved only by grief. And in his search for purity, he had buried every trace of the humanity he once possessed. The winter of 1570 descended upon Russia like a shroud of iron. Rivers froze, fields starved, and even the crows seemed afraid to fly over the land of Ivan's wrath. Yet nothing in nature could match the chill that now crept toward Novgorod, the ancient city of saints and merchants, proud of its independence, rich in faith and gold. Ivan believed Novgorod had betrayed him. Spies whispered of letters sent to Lithuania, of secret plots to crown another ruler. Whether these rumors were true no longer mattered. In Ivan's mind, treason was not an act, it was a scent, and he could smell it. The Oprichniki saddled their black horses once more, their dogs' head emblems gleaming against the snow. What followed would be one of the most gruesome purges in human history. The Tsar rode at their head, wrapped in furs, a silver cross hanging over his chest. Behind him trailed hundreds of riders, executioners, priests, and madmen alike. When they reached the city gates, church bells rang in alarm, but the sound was swallowed by the thunder of hooves. Novgorod's fate was sealed before its people even knew they were condemned. At first, Ivan ordered a procession. Icons were lifted high. Priests marched ahead with incense, begging God to bless their Tsar. But Ivan's prayers were not for mercy. They were for purification through blood. He accused the city's leaders of selling their souls to foreign devils. The archbishop was stripped of his robes and dragged through the streets. His sacred vestments were torn and replaced with chains. Then the slaughter began. Families were rounded up in marketplaces, herded like cattle toward the frozen Volkhov River. Soldiers tied their hands, smashed holes into the ice, and threw them in by the hundreds. Mothers clutched infants as the black water swallowed them whole. The cries of the drowning mingled with the chanting of monks forced to bless the massacre as holy judgment. Ivan watched from his sleigh, wrapped in blankets, a grotesque vision of royal serenity. His lips moved in prayer as bodies floated past him, some still struggling, others stiff as icons. Every so often, he would raise his staff and command, "More traitors. Cleanse the city." His Oprichniki obeyed without hesitation. Monasteries were looted, altars desecrated, and relics smashed underfoot. Those who begged for forgiveness were branded with hot irons or hung from church doors. The streets turned red beneath the snow, and the stench of burning houses filled the air. Even the bells of St. Sophia's Cathedral seemed to toll in mourning, though no priest dared to ring them. For 5 weeks, the killing continued. Entire districts vanished, their inhabitants wiped from record and memory. The few who survived spoke of nightmares, of soldiers laughing as they drowned priests, of Ivan himself weeping as he prayed for the souls he had damned. To him, this was not madness, it was divine duty. When the Oprichniki finally withdrew, Novgorod was silent, a city of ashes and frozen corpses. The Volkhov River carried its dead downstream like offerings to an unseen god. Ivan rode away in triumph, convinced he had saved Russia from betrayal. Yet those who looked into his eyes saw something more terrifying than victory. They saw peace. For in the massacre's aftermath, Ivan found a dreadful calm, as if the screams of thousands had finally lulled his soul to rest. But that peace was hollow, built upon the bones of his people. And as the black horses disappeared into the horizon, only one truth remained. Russia's greatest sin had been committed in the name of salvation. After the blood of Novgorod froze beneath the winter ice, Ivan returned to Moscow not as a ruler, but as something closer to a god or a demon pretending to be one. The Kremlin, once the heart of his empire, became his sanctuary of sin. Hidden behind its stone walls, he created a world that obeyed no law but his desire. These were his forbidden chambers, a labyrinth of silk and iron, prayer and punishment, where no sunlight reached and no conscience dared to follow. Here, night was eternal. Candles dripped their wax like tears over cold marble. The Tsar filled the rooms with strange company, jesters whose laughter masked screams, prophets whose tongues trembled with half-crazed visions, and servants so mutilated they resembled relics of his own cruelty. Each one existed only to feed his delusions, a choir of madness chanting praise to their broken god. Every evening began like a ritual. Ivan entered draped in gold-threaded robes, carrying a cross in one hand and a whip in the other. To him, there was no contradiction. Punishment and prayer were divine instruments. He demanded confessions for crimes never committed, then absolved them through agony. Torture became theater. Pain, his gospel. The air was thick with incense and blood. Ivan's guards, the Oprichniki who survived Novgorod, performed executions as entertainment. Dwarfs danced beside corpses. Priests recited scripture over condemned nobles whose screams echoed like hymns. Ivan watched, expressionless, sipping from a goblet of black wine. Then he would rise suddenly, laughing, and join the performance. Himself, striking a man, blessing another, weeping uncontrollably before returning to silence. Behind velvet curtains, other rituals unfolded, darker still. The Tsar summoned young women from distant villages, promising wealth to their families. They arrived trembling, their faces powdered to hide their terror. Ivan called them his brides of penance. Some he kissed with reverence, whispering prayers as though cleansing them of sin. Others he destroyed in moments of frenzied paranoia, accusing them of impurity, of betrayal, of being Anastasia's ghost returned to mock him. When the night ended, few were seen again. Within these chambers, reality itself began to warp. Ivan's mind, already fractured, dissolved entirely into his fantasies. He spoke with dead saints. He held counsel with demons that no one else could see. He believed his enemies' souls lived within the walls, whispering through the cracks. To silence them, he ordered the stones painted with holy icons, their eyes gouged out so they could no longer watch him. Even his most loyal men, Bezmenov, Skuratov, began to tremble in his presence. They had seen the Tsar flay a man, alive while praying for his salvation, had watched him force monks to bless instruments of torture. They whispered that he no longer ruled Russia, but rather presided over his own personal hell. And yet, in the depths of this depravity, Ivan found moments of twisted peace. As dawn crept above Moscow, he would kneel before a gilded crucifix, blood still on his hands, and whisper, "Lord, I am your humble servant. Forgive me, for my mercy is too weak." The sun would rise, unseen behind the Kremlin walls. The city outside stirred in fearful silence, unaware or unwilling to believe what its Tsar had become. Inside, laughter and sobs blended into one terrible symphony. For within the forbidden chambers, Ivan was no longer the ruler of men. He was the ruler of pain, and his throne was built from the bones of those who dared to love him. By the late 1580s, Ivan's empire trembled not from foreign invasion, but from the chaos that lived inside its ruler's mind. The Kremlin had become a fortress of whispers, its corridors echoing with the faint rustle of fear. Ivan IV, the self-proclaimed God's chosen Tsar, now saw treachery in every corner, even in the eyes of his own blood. Prince Ivan Ivanovich, his eldest son and heir, had once been the promise of a gentler future. He possessed the intellect of his father, but not the cruelty. The faith, but not the madness. Yet in the Tsar's haunted mind, such differences were dangerous. To be merciful was to be weak, and to be weak was to invite betrayal. The Oprichnina, sensing his paranoia, fed his suspicions like wolves fattening their master's rage. The rift began as a whisper. The prince questioned the starving conditions in Moscow, the neglect of the people, the terror of the Oprichnina. To Ivan, it was not concern but rebellion. Each word his son spoke sounded like a sermon against him. Even the prince's young wife, radiant with pregnancy, became a symbol of disobedience. Ivan saw her modesty as insolence, her silence as mockery. One evening in November 1581, as frost veiled the city and the Kremlin burned with torchlight, Ivan stormed into his son's chamber. The young Tsarina stood trembling, her swollen belly barely hidden beneath layers of cloth. She had argued with the guards over a matter of decency, insisting on privacy, refusing to be watched as the Oprichnina inspected the royal quarters. Word reached Ivan that she had disobeyed him. The Tsar entered like a storm. His robes were unfastened, his face red from drink and fury. "Who defies my command?" he thundered. The Tsarina fell to her knees, begging forgiveness. Prince Ivan stepped between them, for the first time, not as a son, but as a man protecting his family. "Father," he said, "if your will destroys innocence, it is no longer divine." Those words, simple yet defiant, ignited the fire that had long waited to burn. Ivan's hands trembled. His eyes widened with disbelief, then rage. "You dare to teach me of God?" he hissed, and before any could stop him, he struck. The staff in his hand cracked against the prince's skull, once, twice, until the chamber filled with screams. The Tsar froze. Blood pooled beneath his son's head, bright against the cold stone. The Tsarina wailed, clutching the prince's body. Servants rushed in, but dared not touch him until Ivan himself collapsed beside the dying heir, sobbing like a lost child. "Forgive me, my son," he whispered again and again, cradling the prince's head in his lap. "I did not mean. Not you." But the boy's breaths grew shallow, his words fading into prayers. "I forgive you, father," he murmured, his eyes unfocused, his voice trembling. Then silence. The moment broke something in Ivan that could never be repaired. The Tsar, who had massacred cities without flinching, now knelt in horror before his own creation. His robes, his crown, his throne, all became meaningless. In killing his son, he had slain the last remnant of the man he once was. Outside, the Kremlin bells tolled, not for a prince, but for a dynasty. The court moved in fearful quiet. The Tsar no longer spoke of succession. He had murdered the only heart capable of redeeming him. That night, the great Ivan the Terrible sat alone, rocking his son's lifeless body beneath flickering candlelight. And for the first time in his reign, Russia's father wept not for power, but for the ghost of his own humanity. The death of his son hollowed Ivan like a cathedral stripped of its saints. The Kremlin fell into a terrible quiet. No laughter, no commands, only the low drone of morning bells echoing through stone. Those who had once feared his wrath now feared his silence. For in that silence, madness fermented. Ivan no longer ruled. He haunted. His face grew pale, his body wasted, but his eyes, those cold blue embers, burned brighter than ever. He spoke little, yet his chambers buzzed with one obsession: Anastasia. The name of his first wife, his only true love, became a prayer and a curse. Decades after her death, he still believed she had been poisoned by the boyars, the same traitors who had taken his mother and now, he thought, his son. One night, as wind howled over the frozen Moskva River, Ivan called his priests and alchemists to his private hall. "Open her tomb," he commanded. "I will see her face again. She will tell me the truth." They protested. It was forbidden, blasphemous. But Ivan's voice left no room for faith or fear. By torchlight, a small procession descended into the catacombs beneath the Kremlin. The air was thick with centuries of dust and prayer. Rats scattered between the stones as the Tsar, draped in black, approached the coffin that had lain sealed for 20 years. "Bring the candles closer," he whispered. His trembling hands rested on the lid. The priests hesitated, then pried the iron nails loose. When the final seal broke, the smell of death filled the chamber, a sickly mixture of rot and roses, as if time itself had tried to mummify love. There she lay, Anastasia Romanovna. The flesh had long since given way to decay, yet her form remained eerily serene. Ivan fell to his knees. "You were my angel," he murmured, "and they stole you from me." He touched her hand. It crumbled to dust, yet in his eyes she was alive again. "Tell me, Anastasia," he whispered through tears, "who poisoned you? Was it the boyars? The priests? Or was it my own sin that killed you?" The priests watched in horror as Ivan pressed his lips to the corpse's forehead, as though blessing it. Then, suddenly he began to laugh, a sound so broken it made even his guards flinch. "She forgives me," he cried. "She always forgives me." From that night onward, Ivan began speaking to her ghost. Servants claimed to hear him conversing softly in the dark, as if confiding in a lover unseen. He demanded her gowns be restored and placed in his chamber. Her portraits were cleaned and adorned with jewels. He dined with an empty chair set beside him, whispering to it as though sharing secrets from their wedding day. His court grew terrified. The Tsar would emerge at dawn, eyes wild, insisting that Anastasia had appeared to him in dreams, warning him of new conspiracies. Every execution that followed, every purge of imagined traitors, he justified in her name. "My Anastasia commands it," he would say. "Her spirit hungers for justice." But there was no justice, only decay, within his empire, within his heart. Late one evening, as candles burned low, Ivan returned once more to the tomb. He knelt before it and pressed his forehead against the cold stone. "Wait for me," he whispered, "for I am coming soon." And in the shadows, with nothing left but guilt and memory, the Tsar of Russia kissed the grave of his own damnation and called it love. The Tsar no longer slept. The walls of the Kremlin pulsed with whispers, the ghosts of all who had died in his name. When night fell, the corridors filled with flickering light and the smell of burning wax. Even the terrible, now old and hollow, had turned his court into a theater of the damned. Banquets were still held, though none dared call them celebrations. Golden plates gleamed under candlelight, the tables heavy with meat and wine. Yet the guests sat in silence, afraid to eat, afraid to breathe. The Tsar entered draped in dark furs, a jeweled cross around his neck, his beard unkempt and streaked with gray. His eyes, once sharp with divine conviction, now glowed with feverish delusion. "Tonight," he declared, raising his goblet, "we dine with my faithful dead." The courtiers glanced nervously toward the empty seats. At first, it seemed that Tsar was jesting. But when he began naming them, Skuratov, Basmanov, even his murdered son, their fear deepened into paralysis. He spoke to the air beside him, pausing as though listening to replies. Occasionally he laughed, a cold, dry sound that echoed through the great hall like the crack of bone. He toasted each phantom. "To my son, who betrayed and forgave me. To Anastasia, my angel and my curse. To the traitors whose screams built my kingdom. Then he drank deeply, spilling wine that glistened like blood. Those who attended were forced to mimic his madness. They raised their cups toward invisible guests, whispering prayers under their breath. For those who failed to play their part, punishment awaited. The Tsar, in his delirium, had begun seeing loyalty in fear and heresy in hesitation. One noble who refused to drink was dragged from the table. His body was found hanging by dawn, a cup of wine spilled beneath him. Each night blurred into the next. Ivan's mind wandered between past and present, dream and delirium. Sometimes he knelt before the throne, muttering to the shadows, "Have I not done God's will? Have I not purified his empire?" Other times he cursed heaven itself, shaking his fist toward the vaulted ceilings. "You made me, Lord," he raged. "You filled me with your fire, and now you abandon me to darkness." He had the church bells silenced, claiming they disturbed his communion with the dead. In their place, he ordered choirs to sing hymns for souls not yet buried. The music echoed through empty halls, merging with his drunken ramblings. Moscow slept in dread, for the Tsar's despair had become a storm that no prayer could calm. At times he believed Anastasia herself sat beside him. He would reach out into the empty air, whispering her name, smiling faintly as if caressed by an unseen hand. Then, just as suddenly, his face would twist with fury. "You mock me!" he would scream, striking the table until the goblets shattered. "You left me to rot among liars and worms." Those closest to him learned to move like shadows themselves, silent, unseen, waiting for the inevitable collapse. For even they knew that Tsar's feast would not end with dawn. In the great hall, the candles burned low. Ivan slumped upon his throne, surrounded by empty seats and cold platters. His head bowed, his lips moving in prayer or madness, no one could tell. And somewhere in the darkness, a whisper answered him. Whether from God, ghost, or guilt, no man dared to know. The Feast of Shadows had begun, and it would not end until the Tsar himself joined the dead he so often summoned. It was the spring of 1584. Moscow's skies hung low and gray, heavy with the scent of thawing earth and death. Within the Kremlin, the once unstoppable Tsar Ivan sat hunched in his private chamber, a man reduced to the shell of his own legend. His beard was white now, his breath labored, and his hands trembled as they clutched the ivory pieces of his chessboard. The game had been his last refuge, one place where he could still pretend control. Across from him sat Bogdan Belsky, his loyal attendant, silent and still as stone. Between them lay a single move, checkmate, but neither spoke. The Tsar's gaze wandered beyond the board, toward the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. They seemed to move, whispering familiar voices, the laughter of his son, the sighs of Anastasia, the cries of those who begged for mercy. "Do you see them, Bogdan?" Ivan asked softly. "They never leave me now." Belsky dared not answer. He simply bowed his head as the Tsar's fingers hovered over the kingpiece. "All these years," Ivan murmured, "I fought for God, yet in the end, it is not his angels who come for me." The chamber door creaked open. The smell of incense and iron filled the air. The Orthodox priests had begun their prayers in the adjacent hall, preparing for Easter. Their chants echoed faintly, weaving through the silence like the hum of a distant storm. Ivan listened, eyes glazed. For a moment, the sound seemed to soothe him. Then, abruptly he laughed, a dry, broken sound. "I have slain more men than I can count," he said. "I have buried saints and devils alike. And still, the earth does not reject me. Perhaps hell has no room left." He reached for his goblet, but his hand shook too violently to lift it. The wine spilled across the chessboard, staining the white squares crimson. He stared at it, transfixed, as though seeing prophecy written in blood. "So this," he whispered, "is how kingdoms fall." Then came the moment. His breath caught. The Tsar's body stiffened. Belsky called out in alarm, rushing forward, but Ivan's face had already turned ghostly pale. The mighty ruler who had terrorized half of Russia now sat frozen, eyes wide open, mouth slightly ajar, as though still mid-prayer or mid-curse. He fell forward, collapsing over the chessboard. The Black King toppled beneath his weight. The game was over. Panic rippled through the Kremlin. Bells began to toll, slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure whether to mourn or celebrate. Outside, the city froze. Peasants crossed themselves, soldiers dropped to one knee, and priests whispered uncertain blessings. Some said they saw ravens circling above the domes of Moscow that night, their cries echoing like laughter. The body of Ivan IV, the Terrible, was dressed in gold and crimson, placed within his coffin like a warlord king of legend. Yet even in death, his face bore no peace, only the faint trace of a smile, as if mocking eternity itself. When the coffin lid closed, a silence fell over the empire. The people did not weep. They listened to the creak of wood, to the shifting of earth, to the weight of history settling upon them. The bells tolled for days, not for Ivan's soul, but for Russia, for the wounds he carved into its flesh, for the fear that would outlive him. In the end, his empire stood vast but hollow, a monument to divine madness, stitched together by blood and terror. His throne remained, but no man dared sit upon it without trembling. And somewhere beyond the veil, in his eternal hall of ghosts, the Tsar raised his goblet one last time, toasting the empire he had loved, destroyed, and forever damned.